Alberta's direct democracy laws are getting quite a workout these days, with a number of recall and referendum petitions in the works. However, the Alberta government's not too thrilled about how their creation is being put to use. We'll delve into that debate next on the Line Alberta Podcast. All right, greetings, folks, and welcome to the Line Alberta Podcast. My name is Rob Breakenridge. So great to have you along with us. This week, a closer look at the state of direct democracy in Alberta and the debate around the two pieces of legislation that give Albertans the right to recall an elected politician and to put a question to Albertans in a referendum. And right now, both of those tools are being put to use. Mind you, the government's not too thrilled about how all of that is unfolding. So a bit of background here was actually going back to former Premier Jason Kenney when these two pieces of legislation were introduced. They weren't actually put into effect until recently under Alberta's current Premier, Danielle Smith. Now, what's also happened is that Alberta's current government and current Premier have made it a little bit easier to both put a question to a referendum and to recall an elected politician, which brings us to where things are at right now. We've got at least a couple of referendum petitions in various stages, and now it sounds like a whole bunch of recall campaigns happening. Now, a couple of these you're probably familiar with. There's Thomas Lukaszuk, former MLA and cabinet minister, his group Forever Canadian, which appears to have successfully concluded their petition campaign, although those numbers or signatures are still being verified. But that was to try to counter the separatist movement, to try to frame a possible question in a certain way. Although, mind you, this group says that the Premier has the option of putting this to a vote in the legislature as opposed to a referendum. But there is that. Another one we covered on this podcast recently, there's a petition that's been approved that would potentially force a question on private school funding. The group in question behind this petition wants to end the public funding of private schools. And you can go back, we did an episode on that recently. So that's on the referendum side. The recall side is interesting right now. So again, the tool exists to, if you can gather enough signatures in a particular riding, and again, those have to come from people in that riding, but you can potentially recall an elected politician. Now, we saw the first attempt at this actually in Calgary last year, when there was a recall effort targeting Calgary's then Mayor Jyoti Gondek. Now, she survived that recall attempt. Of course, she was voted out of office in the recent municipal election. But that was an interesting example of this legislation at work. It did illustrate how high the bar was, because in fact, to recall the mayor of Calgary would have required the signatures of 40% of all eligible voters in Calgary, which was a massive number. And this recall campaign didn't really even get close to that. But it was in the midst of that campaign when Alberta's premier made the announcement that, you know what, we're going to make it a little bit easier to do this. So instead of 40% of all eligible voters, it's now a figure representing 60% of the number of votes that were cast in the previous election. So still a high bar, but not quite as high as it had previously been. So look, the Alberta government didn't raise any objections to the nature of that recall campaign. Again, Calgary's mayor wasn't accused of any malfeasance or criminal wrongdoing. It was just a lot of folks in Calgary who didn't appreciate the job she was doing, didn't appreciate her priorities, didn't appreciate the results, and thought maybe it was time to get somebody else in there. Now, there were those who objected, obviously, and I guess that's part of direct democracy at work. But now it's interesting because the Alberta government does suddenly seem to have some objection to the way in which voter recall is being used. So as it stands right now, Elections Alberta has officially approved 2 recall petitions. One of them targets Calgary MLA and Education Minister Demetrios Nicolaitis. The other that's been approved is targeting Airdrie UCP MLA Angela Pitt. Now, as we record this podcast, the group calling itself Operation Total Recall says there are actually now 9 petitions that have been approved by Elections Alberta, although the agency hasn't formally announced that yet. So things are getting interesting, arguably maybe even a little bit chaotic right now. So again, there's a few steps that these campaigns need to go through. You have 90 days to gather the requisite number of signatures. If you can do that, there would then be a recall vote. a straight up yes or no question on whether you think the MLA should be recalled. And if constituents vote yes, voters vote yes in that riding, the seat would be vacant. There would be a by-election. So there are some steps to be followed. But again, I mean, administering all of this is costly. And it was something actually that the Premier referenced last week. And it should be noted here, too, that Elections Alberta, which is in charge of administering all of this, has actually asked for some additional funds to try to keep their head above water here amidst all of these various petitions and potentially some votes. The request for an additional $13 million in funding, though, was recently shot down by an all-party committee. Instead of $13 million, the UCP used their majority on that committee to whittle that request down to just $1.4 million. So yes, Elections Alberta is certainly swamped these days. But as noted, the UCP doesn't seem too thrilled about how this legislation is being used. Now, again, in the legislation, there's no parameters around why you would recall a politician. It's basically, here's how you do it. Now, there is sort of a cooling off period after an election, and there's a period before the next election where you cannot recall an election. But as far as MLAs are concerned, we're in that zone where it's legal to do so. And that's pretty much it. It doesn't have to be for a certain reason. And right now, there is a lot of frustration in Alberta, especially in the aftermath of the teachers' strike, the Alberta government's decision to use the Notwithstanding clause. Albertans are sort of rebelling against that in a way, and they see this direct democracy tool as a way to express that frustration. Now, making it a little more interesting, of course, is the fact that the UCP is majority in the Alberta legislature. I don't know if you call it shaky, but they're only a few seats above the majority threshold. So if indeed some of their MLAs were taken out by recall legislation and removed from office, that could indeed threaten their majority government. So that does add that extra layer of volatility to all of this right now. So as mentioned, the UCP has objected to some of these recall campaigns, that they say these tools are being weaponized, that there's an organized effort behind this. So last week on Friday, the Premier was asked about this campaign, was asked about the concern maybe that Elections Alberta isn't receiving the amount of funding they need right now to try to stay on top of all of this. And so the Premier responded. Now, she's responding here to the Alberta Federation of Labour. And we did actually speak with their president on a recent episode of this podcast about the use of the Notwithstanding clause and how organized labor might respond now moving forward. Should be noted, the Alberta Federation of Labour says they want to get some referendum questions, so that could potentially be 3 more petitions on use of the Notwithstanding clause and a couple of other issues like the pension plan and minimum wage in Alberta. They say they are generally supportive of these recall campaigns, but I guess it should be noted the Alberta Federation of Labour says they're not involved in any of these recall campaigns. Just to preface this comment last week, here was Alberta's Premier when asked about all of this.
Well, I think Gil McGowan's made it clear he's trying to overthrow our government. Like, that's the wording that he's using. And what we're hearing from the elections officials is just to be able to affirm the signatures in a single petition is 1.1 million, let alone then the second stage of running a recall election, let alone the third stage of running a by-election. So his stunt is potentially costing $5 million for every riding that he's doing it in. And we have to look at that and say, is that really what was the intention of the legislation? And the answer to that is clearly no. The intention of the legislation was to have an opportunity between elections, if there was genuine wrongdoing on the part of an MLA, to have their constituents address it, not some union boss organizing it from Edmonton. So the legislation is also very clear that this is not meant to have people being bussed in from outside the riding and money being raised on GoFundMe from who knows where. So I would say that he needs to check whether or not he's following the legislation, because from our look, it doesn't appear to be. So that's what we're seeing, is that somebody is playing around with, I think, what is a legitimate process and making a mockery of it, quite frankly.
Okay, so again, Alberta's Premier raising some questions around the legitimacy of these recall campaigns, which again, I mean, she can talk about the intent, but if there really was that intent, it would have been easy enough to put that into the legislation. Maybe that's going to be one of the takeaways from all of this, that if you're going to have these tools, maybe it needs some guardrails or some parameters or some limitations. But for now, it seems, this genie is out of the bottle. We're kind of stuck with the legislation as it is, and we're seeing how it is being used. Now, there's the other point the premier raised there about money being splashed around in some of these campaigns. And again, I mean, this is the UCP sort of arguing against the changes they themselves have made. This government has made it easier for union donations, corporate donations to get into politics. Third party groups can raise a lot of money, spend a lot of money. So the premier is concerned about the amount of money going into recall efforts, referendum campaigns. Again, people are just following the rules that this government has put into place. And if there's concern about the rules being enforced, well, that gets back to the question as to whether Elections Alberta has the resources to try to police all of this. So things are getting a little chaotic right now with direct democracy in Alberta. So what does it all mean, and where is all of this going? Does it potentially actually take us to an early general election if the government is looking for a way to short circuit all of this? So it's interesting to see how we've gotten to this point. I had an opportunity to sit down for a conversation with Dr. Jared Wesley. He's a professor of political science at the University of Alberta. He's written a lot about the issue of voter recall, also on the use of the Notwithstanding clause and Bill 2 specifically. As I say, one of the issues I think that has really prompted a lot of this backlash and these campaigns against the government. So here's that conversation I had with Dr. Jared Wesley. Right. Well, joining us now for some further perspective on the state of direct democracy in Alberta, the debate around voter recall, how much of it ties back to the government's decision to use the Notwithstanding clause. Very pleased to welcome here to the line Alberta, Dr. Jared Wesley, professor of political science and associate dean of graduate studies at the University of Alberta. He's also co-author of the new book, No I in Team, Party Loyalty in Canadian Politics. Professor Wesley, great to have you with us here.
Good to be here, Rob.
It's interesting to look back when, these direct democracy bills were first introduced. I think you were one of the experts sort of cautioning the government about going down this path, what these kinds of bills can potentially unleash. Looking back on those warnings, what we're seeing now, what are your conclusions, first of all, so far?
Well, it was foreseeable. I mean, the only time we've seen recall used in Canadian history has been against government MLAs, right, in BC,
right.
And earlier, of course, during the social credit days here in Alberta. So it was entirely predictable that opponents of the government would eventually use this tool to put pressure on government MLAs to change the government's position. In this case, it was on their use of the Notwithstanding clause.
Yeah, and it sounds like, there could be several recall votes. We got 2 approved. I guess as we record this, it sounds like potentially there could be as many as 9. So it's interesting to see some of the momentum behind this. Do you think maybe, I wonder, the UCP sort of thought, well, this is something that kind of our conservative base is clamoring for, therefore, it's not going to be used against us? I mean, was there maybe a false sense of security on their part?
Yeah, I think there probably were some good intentions mixed with some partisan intentions behind making it easier to recall MLAs. I think the focus at the time, if you remember, was to make it easier for folks that lived in municipalities, right, to recall councillors that had fallen into legal trouble or some ethical dilemmas. And I can see a part of that, but they also chose to ignore experts who were telling them then tailor the bill with specific guidelines or rules around when recall can be used. And that's the way it's done in the UK, for instance, and they chose not to. I should say, too, that I'm not a huge fan of direct democracy in general. I think we have a representative system here in Canada that should work quite well. And the more that we allow governments to use these off-ramps, or opposition for that matter, to use these off-ramps instead of treating elections like the formal choices that they are, I think we run into these kinds of problems.
Well, it's interesting because we did see last year a recall campaign against Calgary's then mayor, Jyoti Gondek, which fell short, and it sort of illustrated just how high that threshold was when it came to recalling a mayor. But it was right in the midst of that campaign that the premier said, you know what, maybe we should make it easier to do this. So it was interesting that there weren't really any principled objections to that recall campaign. It wasn't as though the mayor was accused of some specific wrongdoing. The premier now suggesting that there actually is some kind of intent behind this recall legislation that people using it now aren't adhering to or respecting. What do you make of that?
Well, it seems to be a pattern with the Premier's office in that they've passed legislation that suggests which types of people should be voting, right, through the stricter voter ID laws. First, out of the gate this session, we heard the House Leader talk about how it's important that we choose who's serious to run for office or not. And now they're saying that they want to select who's worthy of a recall campaign and who should be shielded from them. So I think Albertans not too long ago will remember when governments wouldn't dabble into these matters in the first place, but when they do, they usually would consult widely, right? And when we make these kinds of changes to our democratic system, our election systems, it's usually done on a multi-partisan basis. And this government seems to not be in the mood to do that kind of consultation.
It was interesting, too, and the Premier was asked about this on Friday, and I think she was kind of responding directly to what the Alberta Federation of Labour is involved in, and I know they're trying to push for some referendum questions, although I don't think they're directly involved in any specific recall campaigns. But the Premier raised the question about money behind all of this. I think she referred to, GoFundMe campaigns from who knows where, something along those lines, which was interesting because I think one of the concerns around, these direct democracy bills and some of the other changes that the government has made is potentially there is a lot of money that could go into a referendum campaign. Like if we end up voting on sovereignty in Alberta, do we have the measures in place, the guidelines, the guardrails in place to really police what kind of money is coming in and being spent in such campaigns?
Well, it's unfortunate because the Premier made it easier for so-called dark money to flow into campaigns, not just recall and referendums, but Alberta democracy in general, right? Because they relaxed rules around campaign finance that makes it easier for unions and corporations, for example, to donate to campaigns again. This has always been the concern for those of us that are long in the tooth and remember the Quebec 1995 campaign. That hinged on a lot of money flowing into that system. And I think the Quebec government at the time was right in calling out the rest of Canada for breaching those kinds of rules. So, there is a real concern that there is too much dark money that we can't trace the origins of in our system in general. And it makes recall and referendum campaigns all the more susceptible.
Well, it's interesting because, Elections Alberta is tasked with being responsible for overseeing all of this, and they're pretty swamped right now, right? Dealing with, I know there's the two referendum campaigns, they're counting all of the Forever Canadian signatures. There's another petition approved on private school funding, now all these recall campaigns, in addition to making sure that, as you say, all these other donation and spending rules are followed. And yet their request for additional funding, I mean, they asked for $13 million to administer all of this. They got, I think, like 1.4. So what do we make then of, the so-called referee in all of this, maybe not having sufficient resources? Does that contribute to some additional chaos here?
Well, again, unfortunately, it's part of a pattern, right? Where not just the Smith government, but before that, the Kenney government, who didn't renew the ethics commissioner's contract, and now the UCP under Smith is not renewing the Auditor General's contract. And while the chief electoral officer will keep their job for a while longer, they don't have the resources necessary to do their work. And this defunding is a way of effectively shutting down some of these attempts by Albertans to engage in direct democracy. And I don't think any government would have anticipated we'd have as many as 9 recall petitions and a number of referendums on the board at this point. Right. So I do sympathize that they probably did not anticipate this. But there was a simple request for funds that they just simply did not in committee approve.
So it's interesting. I mean, look, it would be a bad look on the government to say Albertans deserve direct democracy, and then when they become a target to say, oh, we don't want it anymore. So I don't know that they can just right now scrap the legislation. So it seems like, this horse is kind of out of the barn. We're sort of stuck with this for now. Or what could the government potentially do at this point?
Well, this is what I found interesting. The opposition leader, Hidenshi, on the weekend mentioned that he is actually in support of repealing recall legislation to be one of the first things he does if he's elected premier after the next general election. So there seems to be cross-party support for getting rid of this. But second, I don't know whether the premier would actually allow these by-elections if they're triggered by these recalls, which is a big if. There's a lot of signatures to collect. But if they were triggered, I'm not sure whether the premier would wait around for a series of by-elections to be held as opposed to going early, right? As opposed to going to a general election early. And this is the history of recall legislation in Canada. It's never actually been successful. It's never recalled anyone. the government's usually acted ahead of time, either by repealing the piece of legislation that was in question. And Gordon Campbell repealed HST legislation, for example, in BC, or they scrapped the law entirely, which is what Bill Aberhart did.
Yeah, I think there was even one MLA in BC who ended up resigning before, I think there was one recall campaign that came close. It's interesting, the steps here, right? So there's the petition threshold, which even though the government made it easier, it's still quite a bar to clear. And then I guess there's two steps after that, right? There's a recall vote, which is a yes/no question. Then there'd be the actual by-election. So there's a lot that goes into this. And again, maybe it gets back to the funding question that, direct democracy certainly isn't free. If you think we should have it, you think it's a price worth paying, then maybe the government needs to step up. But there is a lot involved here, isn't there?
Yeah, I would say, but again, I don't think we'll get too many steps down that road. Governments are really pretty good at sensing whether there's momentum against them, and most of the most astute will actually just go to an early election. So this is fueling existing, speculation that the government would want to go early so that it can avoid the rest of the investigation reports that are coming out on the corrupt care scandal. So all things to me are adding up to an election in early 2026.
Should be interesting. What do you make of the fact that this is being used against the government? I don't, it would be, I think, an overgeneralization to say, the left was against having this legislation. Now the left is using it. Is it simply, okay, the government wants to create this, we're going to make use of it? Is there any degree of hypocrisy on the part now of those organizing these campaigns?
Well, this is, again, part of a broader pattern or trend throughout North America. So you'll notice that the parallels between this and what Gavin Newsom's Democrats did in California a few weeks ago during that election with their proposition to allow the state to gerrymander its own ridings in response to gerrymandering in Texas, right? So it's a matter of folks on the left, be they progressives or liberals, New Democrats, actually using the tools that right-wing parties have brought in against them. Now, there'll be those that, like me, that stand on principle and say you should probably just play by the normal standards, rules, customs, norms of the game. But there's an argument to be made that if other folks are going to use these tactics against us, we might as well use them against them.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, the lack of parameters here, and I think that's a legitimate point that's come up in all of this, right? The government trying to imply now that there was some intent behind this legislation, as opposed to actually putting something down in writing, where you have an MLA or an elected politician that's accused of wrongdoing, malfeasance, maybe charged with a crime, or one who simply goes AWOL and isn't representing their constituents. Is there something to be said for a more limited form or a more targeted form of voter recall?
Well, again, that's what the government was advised to do from the very beginning, right? To tailor it the way that they do in the UK, to say there's only these following circumstances under which you can recall your member of the Legislative Assembly. I also want to remind everyone that we are in unique times here as well, right? I mean, let's not forget the source of the anger that is pushing people to turn out and sign petitions in record numbers. I mean, first the Lukaszuk Forever Canadian petition that collected north of 400,000 signatures, the largest petition in Canadian history. And now we're seeing, thousands, if not tens of thousands of Albertans signing up to recall a variety of different MLAs. A lot of people will say, well, that's, that kind of support is a mile wide and, that has the depth of a finger bowl, to borrow Jason Kenney's metaphor. True enough, but I think it also speaks to the fact that a lot of Albertans for a while have been looking to do anything to voice their alienation from the broader political system. For some folks, that's alienation from Ottawa, but there's also been a ton of folks that feel like their voice is not being heard here in Edmonton, right, and within the halls of the legislature. And so I'm not as pessimistic as some of my colleagues in saying that these recall petitions won't work, because I think there's just a groundswell of people that want to do something, do anything, and signing their name on a petition is pretty much the least they can do. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Actually, the Notwithstanding clause is one of the issues that the Alberta Federation of Labour says they want to try to organize a petition around. So that would be quite a spectacle to have Albertans voting on, some question related to that, limiting the government's use perhaps of the Notwithstanding clause. But how much do you think that's kind of at the core of a lot of what we're seeing right now? The way the government has already used the Notwithstanding clause with regard to the teacher strike, it sounds like they're getting set to use it once again.
Yeah, I think that's one story, but we can't again ignore where this kind of push for direct democracy started, and it was with the Forever Canadian petition. I think that there is a lot of Albertans who have a conservative disposition, right? As Ken Bosenkool refers to it. They may not be ideologically conservative, but they don't like to rock the boat. They're not radicals. When they hear things like separatism, when they hear things like using the notwithstanding clause, they get their backs up because they don't want these the unusual use of these tools for political purposes to go on in their province, right? And so I think what we're seeing, ironically, is a bunch of folks who are predisposed to be conservative and to honestly just go along to get along, standing up for the way that things are, not necessarily, in full support of the status quo as it exists, but definitely saying the direction we're headed is just not the right one.
With regard to Bill 2, which was the legislation that ended the teachers' strike, included the use of the notwithstanding clause, the blowback there has been considerable. I think maybe there's some sense of relief in Alberta that the teachers' strike is over, but I think the way in which all of this was handled really seemed to anger a lot of Albertans. Were you surprised even to the extent in which there was that blowback to Bill 2?
I wasn't surprised because I think folks on both sides of this issue, the leaders on both sides of this issue, have ignored the fact that there's a mushy middle, right? So we have been told over the last month that you have to pick a side. Either you're with the teachers and with human rights, right, on one hand, or you're not. Or from the government's perspective, either you're with sending the kids back to school or you're not. But there's a large number of Albertans who are quite happy to see the teachers go back to work and the kids go back to school. Count me among them. There's a lot of folks who are not 100% behind the teacher's position in this. Count me among them. But who look at the way the government did it and said that this is just wrong. Like, there were other options available to the government. As much as they will tell you they didn't have a choice, they did have a choice. Governments have ended strikes of public sector workers before without using the notwithstanding clause. They have to use an argument that minimally impacts the people that they're stripping those rights away from. In this case, it would have involved, for example, going to formal arbitration, but they chose not to. I think a lot of Albertans are smarter than leaders on both sides give them credit for. There's some nuance here. And I think Albertans are standing up on the fundamental principle in favor of human rights. I guess we'll see if the government chooses to use it a second time, whether that chorus of opposition continues to grow.
Well, it is interesting because obviously, we didn't have voter recall at the time the charter was brought in, but the idea that the notwithstanding clause should exist so that there's the democratic accountability of the politicians having the final say on these matters. Well, you could argue in a way that we're kind of seeing potentially that accountability, in the way in which voters in Alberta are making use of these direct democracy tools. But I guess the other side of it too is, it's one thing to say, okay, we want the Democratic elected leaders to have the final say, but the way in which Bill 2 was rammed through the legislature, there really wasn't that democratic accountability component, was there?
No, and that's the position we're in, right? Where our entire system is built around representative democracy, or a democratic form of representation, where we send MLAs to make decisions on our behalf. And in this case, the government side MLAs chose to remove that power from their own, from their own set of abilities, right? They chose to limit debate to 1 hour per stage. They chose to remove themselves from that democratic deliberation, which is odd, but it reflects this growing sense of hyper-partisanship that we write about in our book, No I in Team, right? There's this sense that they need to rally behind the leader. And if that means staying silent on a matter of human rights, then so be it. But that actually flies in the face of what's written in the notwithstanding clause itself. It doesn't say premiers shall be able to abrogate citizens' rights. It says legislatures shall. And I think, you wouldn't see me writing nearly as much as I have on the topic if this issue had been given full debate the way that Peter Lougheed wrote it should be. If it had been done, in the light of day as opposed to the middle of the night, or if the premier herself had been present in the House instead of jetting off overseas, right? And I think, that's really where a lot of conservatives have issue, right? Is that it's just not being done the right way. Should we have ended the strike? Sure. I think there are a lot of conservatives out there that will say that the transgender legislation that's about to roll out is necessary for whatever reason. And we can have some open debates about that. But let's have those open debates, right? Let's not close them off with closure, and let's not do an end run around Section 1 of the Constitution.
So to use the notwithstanding clause yet again, as it seems the Alberta government is poised to, does that kind of fan the flames of just kind of this volatility in Alberta right now?
Well, I think they're tempting fate. I mean, when you have up to 9 of your MLAs currently, under the gun with recall legislation, that you're really, tempting fate in the sense that people might be animated to go out and sign that petition. Again, it's a low bar of participation here. Mm-hmm. I would hope that gives the government a reason for pause. But again, I don't want to say that I'm completely against the use of the notwithstanding clause. I've written that Pierre Poilievre's use of the notwithstanding clause, for example, was an interesting one. In the last federal election, he said he would use it in order to protect his tough on crime legislation, and he wanted to have an open debate about it. And it was in response to a series of court rulings that had already suggested that the Harper government's approach to that was not in keeping with the Constitution. There are ways to do this, right? But the government here in Alberta seems unwilling to pursue those other routes.
And you mentioned it already. I mean, the one way, I guess, to avoid any potential recall votes, not to mention some potentially divisive referendums, might be to just pull the trigger on an early election. Is that getting increasingly likely in your view?
It's becoming more likely. It's tough to tell what happens, 2 or 3 weeks from now, let alone a few months. But again, we're anticipating a bunch of different investigations, an RCMP investigation into the corrupt care scandal. We're anticipating the Auditor General to come out with reports. These are looming in the background here, and it only with people looking at different sides of the procurement issue, eventually targeting the Premier's office staff, which seems to be at the heart of the controversy. That's something I don't think they want to go to the electorate on, right? I mean, just self-preservation, which if there's any guiding principle for most politicians, and Danielle Smith in particular, it's self-preservation. I think it just makes sense for them to go early.
Well, and I guess too, I mean, a pipeline announcement that's completely unrelated to any of this, but that kind of a deal with Ottawa would also be a handy springboard into a campaign, wouldn't it?
Well, it depends on the content of the deal, because the other thing that's looming in the background here is the separatist movement, and the rumblings online are that no deal with Ottawa is worth the paper that it's written on, and we can't trust Danielle Smith to negotiate something that the separatists will approve of. And so all roads right now are leading to their AGM later on in November, where a lot of these discussions are going to be held on the floor, whether formally or informally, in back rooms or in public. And it'll be interesting to see how the Premier navigates those discussions.
Yeah, no kidding. Some interesting weeks and months ahead for sure. We mentioned the book. It's out now. It's called No I in Team, Party Loyalty in Canadian Politics. Jared Wesley, really appreciate your insight on all of this. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Thanks, Rob.
And our thanks once again to Dr. Jared Wesley, again, Professor of Political Science, also Associate Dean of Graduate Studies at the University of Alberta. Some interesting points about the debate around direct democracy and where all of this is likely going here in Alberta. So it is going to be an interesting few weeks. Again, if the Alberta government's prepared to use the notwithstanding clause yet again. And of course, we've got the UCP AGM coming up. We've got the potential of a deal or an announcement between Alberta and Ottawa. And we'll see what happens with some of these petitions and recall campaigns. So all of that's happening all at once in Alberta. What does it mean for 2026? We're not supposed to have a general election in Alberta until 2027. Alberta's premier, aside from all of this, has already suggested that there would be referendum questions that her government would put on the ballot sometime in 2026. And this would flow out of the Alberta Next process, maybe a vote on a provincial pension plan or provincial police force or potentially some other issue. There is still the possibility or even arguably the likelihood that Albertans could be voting in a referendum on independence or separation at some point next year. Again, depending what happens with the Forever Canadian petition and how the Alberta government chooses to respond to that, or in fact, whether the Alberta separatists are able to mount their own petition campaign and frame a question a certain way, although that's right now bogged down in the courts. Ultimately, a judge is going to have to decide whether it is indeed constitutional to frame a question that way. So that is yet to be decided. So there's all of that potentially in 2026, in addition to, who knows, some recall votes maybe. As Dr. Wesley says, it's not so easy to recall a politician. to get enough signatures within a riding, within that 90-day time frame, and then to clear the hurdle of passing a recall vote, paving the way for a by-election. But those could potentially be happening in 2026 too. And again, there's that additional possibility that Professor Wesley mentioned that maybe as a way of just kind of short-circuiting all of this, the Alberta government just says, okay, the hell with it, let's just have a general election. And they could try to make that argument, I suppose, that these recall petitions, all of these campaigns have just made it so chaotic that they need a new mandate, that we just need to give Albertans a say right across the board. And that might be a jumping off point for a general election. So it is interesting. And I suppose you could argue maybe a little bit volatile in Alberta right now, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's a lot of robust debate happening around some important issues. And I think Albertans that disagree with the direction of the government or don't feel like they have a voice, they see that now, you know what, the government did actually give us a tool. So this is a way for us to have a say and have a voice. And people seem motivated by this and are getting involved. So it is a little bit messy, but I think we knew that, creating direct democracy or expanding these tools, it potentially is messy. And I think, true believers in direct democracy would say that's okay. That's part of it. Democracy can be messy, but it's better than all the other options. Does this government, though, still support it? Now, this might serve as an example to other governments in Canada. Maybe you don't want to go down this path. Maybe it's not worth having voter recall or referendum, citizens initiative because of how chaotic it can potentially be. Maybe this government in Alberta will say, okay, well, let's keep these tools, but let's rein them in a little bit. Maybe we lowered the bar too much, or maybe they need some additional guidelines or parameters. So we'll see what the fallout is from all of that, but no doubt interesting times in Alberta. You can read a little bit more on this issue. I have a piece up at alberta.readtheline.ca. And of course, that's where you can follow us and subscribe. Again, alberta.readtheline.ca. That's where we will leave it for this episode of the Line Alberta Podcast. Again, my name is Rob Breakenridge. Thanks so much for being with us. We'll talk to you next week. Take care.